The Premier League's back and Newcastle United start a mammoth run of 7 games in 22 days at Brighton on Saturday. In this video, I'm going to be discussing who I think will start in the game, as well as updates on Lewis Hall and Yoane Wissa. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It has been a while, but I am back after the international break, and so are Newcastle United. 7 games in 22 days starting at Brighton on Saturday, as I said in the intro, and it's a huge game. There's obviously a very, very poor record at Brighton, given that Newcastle have only won once in the modern history there, once at the Amex Stadium, and that was in the Championship under Rafa Benitez. Lots of draws, lots of difficult results there as well. Newcastle were beaten 3-1 with Evan Ferguson scoring a hat-trick. Obviously, Brighton are a very, very good side. We will talk more about the game more in detail later in the video, but we're going to start with updates from Craig Hope in the Mail yesterday that I thought were really interesting. One on Yoane Wissa and one on Lewis Hall. Now, we know that Lewis Hall has this hamstring problem which came out of nowhere, really. He played against Union and looked absolutely fine as part of his recovery, and there was all the talk about psychological issues and trusting his body. That was the main reason why he was struggling so much, and then suddenly it came out against Nottingham Forest as to why he wasn't in the squad from Eddie Howe, that he picked up a hamstring problem in that game and he was due to have a scan. The results of that scan, according to Craig Hope, are positive. He might be back in November around the international break by that time, and that's a positive for Newcastle, much needed positive if that's the case, because there has been such a problem at fullback. We'll obviously talk more about Dan Burn and his return to Brighton, probably at left back, as I say, in a little bit. But I think Newcastle desperately need Lewis Hall back as soon as possible because of the vulnerability that having Burn at left back, that's so well documented, everyone's talking about it, brings Newcastle. But that's a positive. And also another positive, according to Craig, is that Yoane Wissa, who may well be back for the Brentford game in this run, at the end of this run, I think at the early stages of November. Obviously, he's had a bit of a delay because he was supposed to be aiming for this game against Brighton or at an earlier stage initially for his return, or for his opportunity to make his debut, if you like. He hasn't even trained with Newcastle yet. That's the major shame. But the big news from Craig on Wissa is that he may not go to the African Cup of Nations. It's not been decided. He hasn't done his ACL as well, which is a big plus. And obviously that was a vicious rumour that's gone around a couple of times. I think a lot of people have said a couple of things, and it's been a little bit hush-hush on the whole thing, which I've often said this about Newcastle and the way that they've not commented on these things. They've allowed narratives to get out of hand and then reacted to them. We saw that in the summer with Alexander Isak at times. We've seen that with previous injuries as well. So hopefully Yoane Wissa is back in the early stages of November, but also hopefully he doesn't go away to the African Cup of Nations, because that is the real crux of what I think was a worry for Newcastle fans, because he's not been featuring in the early weeks. He was then always likely to disappear for a few weeks in the winter to go to the AFCON, and then, having paid £55 million for him with a year on his contract at the age of 28, all of these things, this has sort of been the sort of fear, and that has developed, and there's a difficult sort of narrative around Wissa at the moment. If he hits the ground running, gets into form, and hopefully then stays instead of going to the AFCON, then he can have a real impact at a crucial point, I think, in the run-in around Christmas, because that's when this sort of season will turn. I think from now until Christmas is a really crucial point, because as we've said so many times in these videos, it was always expected Newcastle were going to have a tough start because of the Isak stuff, and there was always mitigation, but that was going to go at some point. And after the Arsenal game, I was very scathing of the performance. I was saying that there wasn't much opportunity to fall behind and catch up. I think, yes, Newcastle were in 12th December of last year, but they can't rely on being in that similar situation, because they had Alexander Isak hitting the ground running between December and March, and they had all the players fit and ready and going. I think that is such a big difference that's going to come this season, because there's going to be so many more games. As I said, 7 games in 22 days. That's only sort of mid-November, and then you're in the running before Christmas. It's going to be so hectic. We know that the injury situation from 2 years ago, that's what Newcastle have learned from, and that's why Yoane Wissa and Lewis Hall will be given opportunities to really fully get back to their best before they come into the team, I think, if possible. This run of games is going to be so crucial. Obviously, on top of this, Ross Wilson's come in, and I haven't talked about that because I think we've talked about it enough. We know what the sporting director needs to do. We talked about the contract situation. His first job is apparently, according to Mark Douglas quickly, to tie down Tonali, Botman and Livramento to new contracts, and that is really where his first protocol lies. Obviously, the Elliot Anderson stuff is back live again. I've wrote a piece on that for Forbes, which is in the description, because of his links to Nottingham Forest as well. So there's plenty to mull over for Ross Wilson, but Newcastle is straight back into action. So we'll talk about the Brighton game. And Brighton are a good side. They're a really good side. They're a bit flaky away from home, but they've got a very good record at home. They're unbeaten. They've already beaten Manchester City as well. And they came back from behind against Tottenham too. So they are a really good side. They can't be taken lightly. Newcastle obviously won't do that because they've got such a terrible record anyway. Last season was a really difficult game. Obviously, Isak's penalty was the difference maker in the Champions League in the end. But Newcastle dominated that game, didn't put their chances away, and were undone by a Yankuba Minter goal. Of course they were. And that's where my big fear lies in this game. Minter against Dan Burn. And people are talking about Dan Burn at left back. I think we have discussed it, but again, I'll just explain why I think Dan Burn at left back is such a problem now compared to 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when he played left back regularly in the team and Newcastle qualified for the Champions League. That is no longer the same picture because Newcastle's midfield isn't as intense anymore. The ball gets through quite a lot. They are more passive in a positive way in terms of restoring energy and dominating the game and winning the game in third gear. That's what they're aiming to do, become more possession based. Tonali gets on the ball more, and Bruno and Joe Linton are really, really good at what they do, but the ball does get through that midfield a lot more. Anthony Gordon has to adjust his game and track back a bit more. Joe Linton has to come back a little bit more, and opposition teams have begun to really target Dan Burn, and that's a real problem I think Newcastle face, especially with Yankuba Minter being so quick and so dynamic and so willing to sort of put players on the back foot immediately. That'll be what Brighton will look to do, and it's going to be very difficult. So really Newcastle need to win the midfield battle. They did that, I think, back in May and had opportunities that they just didn't put away, and they didn't force the issue enough in the first half. They need to be able to do that a little bit more. Voltemada up front has looked very good, obviously, in recent weeks, scoring goals, and I think he has begun to do his job. And also, there were signs for Newcastle's wide players against Union, and also a little bit more against Nottingham Forest. It was a little bit cagey in the first half, but Newcastle's wide players are the key to making this attack click for them. And I've said that before, and I'll say it again. In this game, Newcastle need to stretch the pitch and get Gordon and Elanga, who I've gone for in my team selection, into the game really well. Obviously, as I say, Brighton's record is very good at the Amex this season. Newcastle's record at the Amex generally is very, very poor. But in terms of form, last couple of games against Union and Nottingham Forest should give them a huge amount of confidence. A draw wouldn't be the end of the world, especially because Newcastle's defensive record is so good. There's an opportunity, I think, to build from that good base and impose themselves a little bit more out wide. That'll unlock this game, I think, a bit more. But they also have to be very, very wary of Brighton's ability to stretch the pitch. Whoever stretches the pitch more, whoever gets their wide players into the game, I think will probably win this game or have a huge opportunity to do that. So here's my 11. It's basically as you were. It's what you would think is now Newcastle's strongest 11 or possible strongest 11 at the moment in terms of Nick Pope in goal. I think the defence, obviously, in the circumstances, picks itself because Dan Burn has to play at left back. You've got Botman and Chow, who have been absolutely wonderful together. I've waxed lyrical on these videos. I've written pieces. I've watched them very closely at St James's Park against Nottingham Forest as well, and they were wonderful together. So they will obviously continue at the back. Trippier at right back. In the midfield, you've got Tonali, you've got Joe Linton, and you've got Bruno. Again, whenever that midfield is available, it will be picked, I'm pretty sure. Maybe Jacob Ramsey could be back on the bench, which will be really interesting. That hasn't been mentioned. Obviously, he was training before Nottingham Forest and was said to be in contention, but wasn't in the squad. Hopefully, he'll be back for this one, which would be a massive positive, but I don't imagine he'll come in from the start. And then Gordon, obviously, on the left, naturally. Voltemade up front again, naturally. The only question is Elanga on the right-hand side. And I think because Brighton will look to dominate the ball at times and there'll be opportunities in transition, that's when you want Elanga. You want Elanga with space ahead of him, with grass to run into, that he can really hurt Brighton at source. And I think that's what Eddie Howe will be looking to do. I think there will be changes over the next 7 games because, as I say, they're coming in thick and fast. But in this game, I think it'll be as you were, because Newcastle have really got that momentum. They're winning games, and Eddie Howe doesn't like to change a winning team. I am recording this video a little bit earlier, so it's before the presser, so it could be pod-bombed a little bit, but I'm so busy today that I had to get sitting down and recording a little bit earlier. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm on Patreon. You can join me on the link below for $4.99 a month after a 7-day free trial for extra content. If you want to just support me, you can do it for $2.99 a month, where you get ad-free versions of these videos. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.